Welcome back to a short video series that I am doing exploring JavaScript and how it handles object-oriented programming. In this video, we're going to go behind the scenes again. So if you haven't seen part 1, please do so. I'm going to just assume a lot of that stuff just in those relationships carries on right into this video. In this video, I borrow heavily again from that Schaul video that I had recommended in the first part. You'll see that again, the link in the notes of this video, because I found this example of walking through an array very helpful. It really just helped cemented the ideas for my mental model. So I definitely want to cover that here. As you can see from our code here, we're going to be working with an array. So let's go ahead and get this started in our diagram over here. We have our cool beans R, which is a cool beans array with a few string values in it. And check the type of this cool beans R. It's an object. Well, we know that. Arrays are objects. So let's update our diagram to reflect that same object diagram that we've been using. Alright, we have our cool beans array object, and we have our values here. But wait a second. We know that objects are composed of key value pairs. So our values in our array, in our object, are here, but what are the keys? Let's go ahead and I'm going to give you a clue, and let's access these values as we normally would. Let's say we're just going to console log the values in this cool beans array. As expected, we log each one of these values at the 0, 1, and 2 index of our cool beans array. We get the values. Well, this looks an awful lot like object bracket notation syntax. What if we put this in bracket notation syntax? We get the same thing. I thought they were cool when I first found out that this is how arrays. I knew they were objects, but you know, as you're learning, all the pieces are slowly clicking into place, and this just made so much sense to me. So let's go ahead and update our diagram here to reflect our knowledge of the key value pairs that are in our object, our cool beans array object. So we've added our keys in, these properties. Does cool beans have this property? Let's take a guess. Run it. True. Yeah. Oh, and we can see these are strings. So let's update our properties over here on cool beans to reflect the strings. Okay, so now everything is starting to fit nicely into the mental model we have for objects themselves. Well, let's go ahead and check and see if cool beans, this object, what it was constructed by. Let's use our cool constructor call and check and see what value is at that property. And we see that cool beans r.constructor was put together. It's an object that was constructed by a function named array. Well, let's try to get that constructor property in its correct place. Cool beans, if it owns the property constructor, and then at the same time we're just going to check this array function if it has its own property. And false, neither of them own that. Well, if you've seen part 1, then you have a pretty good idea where I'm going next, but let's go ahead and get that up here. So we know that when JavaScript can't find the property it's looking for in an object, it looks to the hidden prototype reference and goes up the prototypal chain to see. So we're going to look at this the prototype, get the prototype of this cool beans object, and we see that true, it does equal this array.prototype. So we add that in our diagram, and we can see that array.prototype logs true. So now we can go ahead and constructor property on this object. And we can see that coolbeans.constructor is strictly equal to array.prototype.constructor. So all of these relationships we have gone ahead and verified. Well, you know what? Since we're here, we haven't looked at the array function object. Let's think about what we talked about at the end of the part 1 video, and think about where we might find some of the methods that we use with arrays. Where do you think we're going to find those in this diagram? Back to the documentation to find out. So we're back within the documentation. Remember, again, at the end of part 1, we were looking at the object. Well, now we're looking at array, and we can again look at the notation here. We see array.prototype.every, array.prototype for each, index of, map, push, reduce. All of these methods that we have been working with and that we use over and over, we can see now where this functionality is found. Array.prototype. There it is. So within this object right here, we could fill in all of these methods. There's a few here. Array.from, array.isArray, static methods. So if we see those static methods, where are we going to find those in our diagram on this side? Not within this prototype object. We're going to find them on the array function object itself. So it'll be populated over here at the same level as this prototype property. And that explains how we call these different methods and the difference in why we need to specify that differently and what JavaScript is doing behind the scenes. Let's jump back to our code example. So I've fleshed out our diagram over here to reflect that we've just been discussing, and let's go flesh out the relationships here. We see our hidden prototype reference. We know that every object in JavaScript has a hidden prototype reference, and see where these are pointing. We're going to get the prototype of, which is going to access that hidden prototype reference. We're going to get that prototype of the array function object itself, and then we're going to get the prototype of this object that's at the prototype property on the array function object. And we see that function.prototype and object.prototype are the two objects that each of these hidden prototype references are pointing to. Well, we know from part 1 how each of these objects has its own hidden prototype reference, and we've already been through these two objects that I jokingly referred to as the God objects. All of these relationships, how these are. So let's go ahead and get all those diagrammatic relationships back up here on our screen. So we can see all of these, the diagram of all these relationships back up here, which we went and we explained at the end of part 1. And it's a cluster, but if we look at relationships and we start to see patterns, then a lot of this started making sense to me. When we see this hidden prototype reference, quote-unquote a plain object, we can see it go up chain function that constructed it and look at prototype property object, and that itself points up the chain until we end with this prototype property object on the object function, and that ends in null. Kind of see that chain with objects, and then with functions, if a function object itself, not the object at its prototype property, but the function object itself, it has a hidden prototype reference, and where are all of those pointing? They're all pointing to this prototype property object on the function object. We can see all of these, they're all pointing back to this, and that makes sense to me. I'm like, okay, each of these is a function. It needs to go back, if it needs some functionality, it needs to go back up the chain and look for any functionality that might be in this function prototype property here. Alright, and then the object itself, each of these is these prototype objects within aren't a function themselves, they're just an object, and we can see that these hidden prototype reference kind of go up the object chain, and we know that that ends in null. So this was really helpful for me to understand and see the relationships between all these things, and again, we're going to use this information in the coming videos that talk about more object creation patterns. But that's it for this one. Thanks.